that Scrum is push-based and Kanban is pull-based. Why? It depends on how the work is allocated into the iteration.
Having that strong leadership to go to somebody and say, you know, where are we at on this? And when they say, oh, it works, but I'm optimizing it.
Because they know what to do. They've solved all of the authentication and authorization issues from a back end. Hey, welcome to Dev Better, coming to you live from my home office again. Today, with me, I have the man, the myth, the legend, cashierless store creator extraordinaire, Sam Hosig. Hey, Sam, what's going on, man?
Not much. Another day in paradise.
Sam is a principal engineer for us, an ex-engineering manager, which is a new thing at 7Factor. And by the way, our EMs can move between different positions, which is kind of really cool. And he has a lot of experience working across various SDLCs, as do myself. And today, we're going to talk about the most clickbaitiest title possible, and that's Scrum versus Kanban. I've gotten in trouble on the internet a few times for calling Scrum dumb, so I'm going to go on record again calling Scrum dumb. But we can discuss why it's an important framework. Again, I say that tongue-in-cheek. It's a very important framework. It's an iteration of the Blessed Agile that I think is an incredibly important piece of how software is delivered. Today, we want to talk about Scrum and Kanban and sort of the differences between the two. And before any of the Kanban aficionados that clickbaited this are thinking we're going to discuss things like Goldrat's theorem, we're not. So you can go ahead and click off. We appreciate your support. Thank you so much. But we're not going to dig into the depths of Kanban, Goldrat, and all the super lean Six Sigma type things that are associated with Kanban as a process. There are much better videos out there, like Pratik's Drunk Agile podcast. Like, there's a lot of really good stuff that you can go and look at that will help you understand more about the depths of WIP and flow theory and etc. What we want to discuss is Scrum and Kanban from a developer's user experience point of view, which is a little bit of a unique take. I've been doing Scrum for forever. I've been doing Kanban for less than forever. Sam's done both on his teams, and he's done both with his clients, and we've even migrated several clients from Scrum to Kanban, and then some clients went back to Scrum. Again, I don't care. As long as software is being delivered and it's not ruining my engineers' lives, we will use whatever makes the most sense. So let's kick it off and just talk about the two systems. And before I discuss the depths of Scrum versus Kanban, I want to talk about pull versus push, right? An important idea for you to understand when you're thinking about these software development life cycles is a pull system versus a push system. And you can kind of argue one or the other way for each if you really think about it for 20 seconds. But I want to define for the moment and for this conversation that Scrum is push-based and Kanban is pull-based. Why? It depends on how the work is allocated into the iteration, right? Every SDLC has a concept of an iteration, and that iteration is some time period in which we are doing work and producing assets that go hopefully into production if you're using continuous delivery, right? So Scrum, in a Scrum system, the Scrum Masters and the product owners and everybody gets together in a room, and if you're in Safe Agile, you do this for like an entire quarter, which is insane, but okay. And we discuss what we're going to do, and we sign up for a block of work, which is called a sprint commit, and that is based on some metric. Most people use velocity or story points. Again, I'm on record saying story points is not a great way to define any form of velocity, but throw rocks at me in the comments, don't care. And then we work on that, and then we produce an asset out the other side, and then we move on. We clean up. We have a cleanup step after that iteration, and that cleanup step typically involves looking at existing tickets that weren't finished, moving them forward. Maybe you play the silly game where you half points and you apply partial points, or whatever you decide to do. Kanban, on the other side of the spectrum, is a pull-based system, right? What that means is I put a stack of papers on my desk, and I go to my engineering team, and I say, each one of you walk up to that stack of papers. It's a queue, right? First in, first out, or last in, first out. And you pick the top piece of paper off of that queue, and then you go over to your desk, and you process it. And then you get it into production, and then you come and you pick the next one off the queue, and you process it. You see how that's pull-based, right? The velocity and the speed at which software is delivered is based on the speed at which the engineers can produce the work. Now, again, both of these systems are valid. They both solve problems. But I want us to spend this time talking about developer experience. Think if you're on the floor doing the work. So, my first question to my guest that we're going to discuss, Scrum. When you walk into a Scrum system, what is the first thing you think about, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of a lot of feelings go towards like what kind of metrics are people judging me against, and sometimes it's even how do I like game those metrics to some degree, to make myself look better. Um, it's looking at from like a top level. We have 2 weeks to complete, X number of stories or work items, and that to me is just like, okay, if I knock it out in a week, do I just sit there twiddling my thumbs, or what's our process from here? So, looking at it, I can understand, the 2 weeks or whatever the time domain it is, and how it can be beneficial. But at the same time, it always sort of like gives me a little bit of pause when I see the Scrum name thrown out there, just because it is like, I know there are these metrics that I'm not always sure how you're calculating, and it's sort of used as a performance review for what we're doing. And so, it always just gives me a little bit of pause of like, what's going on here, and are we doing the most amount of work, or are we doing, something that makes ourselves look, maybe more efficient or better than we actually are.
Yeah, I didn't pay him to say that. That's just, and I've had the same experience when I've walked into any form of Scrum system. I remember back when I first discovered Agile. I was working at Microsoft, and this was after the Danger acquisition, and we were doing Scrum. We were doing Agile, right, with the capital A. And honestly, it was not at all what you see on your average implementation these days. What happened is that a lot of the management consulting firms, again, I'm blaming Deloitte and Accenture for this, sorry guys, came in and saw this as a business opportunity to create some form of alignment and some form of revenue stream around teaching people how to do this. When if you look again back at the Agile Manifesto, it was written by developers. It wasn't written by business consultants. So there's a lot of misplaced sort of ideas that were pulled into the sort of Scrum ecosystem that weren't there at the initial iteration of the Agile Manifesto. No, I'm not saying that every Agile system is bad, or every Scrum, system is bad. So please, nobody flame me too hard. But what Sam just described is what I have encountered as well. When I walk into a Scrum system, the first thing I'm thinking is, I have committed to X, right? And I have to get X done, right? And me as someone who wants to produce value for my company and wants to create software, I'm going to do everything I can to get my commit done, because I said I would, right? I'm a person of integrity. I believe in doing what I say and meaning what I say, and my yes is my yes and my no is my no. So if I'm like, I'm committing to my 15 points or whatever it is, I'm just going to go and do it. And the funny thing, and we've talked about this in other episodes, and with the Scrum anti-patterns with Colleen Johnson, like we talked about these things where our focus tends to shift as developers, where our goal is to preserve ourselves, right? And the system facilitates this. Now, good Scrum Masters, good product owners, good leadership will alleviate this problem, right? So if you are in charge of a Scrum SDLC, and leaders who are listening to this, you know this, you've done this before, you are constantly mitigating for some of the shortcomings of the system, because it's not perfect. If you think it's perfect, you're insane. It's not. No system is perfect, right? So from my perspective, understanding how this impacts our engineers and how this can cause those anti-patterns is an important piece to help you alleviate some of the issues that are inherent into a push-based system. So let's converse that with, Sam, when you're in a Kanban system, what are the first things that come to your mind? Again, this is completely unscripted. He didn't know I was going to ask him these questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit more, it's not necessarily I'm committing to everything for this sprint, and that's what I have. It becomes a little bit more of just like, I'm going to take this task, I'm going to do it the best of my ability, and we are going to, get that all the way to production. It feels a little more free. I don't feel necessarily handcuffed by coming in and putting story points and hours to a certain task and saying like, this is going to take X amount of time. Kanban, at least in the implementations that we've worked here at Seven Factor, and I've worked in the past, is a little bit more of a, we'll do the work, we'll look at, sort of metrics on the backside and understand roughly how long things should take based on, our story writing ability more than our engineering guessing ability at how long things are going to take in the unknown. So I think with Kanban, it just gives me more of a sense of freedom than it does, looking at Scrum, where it does feel a little bit more handcuffed in I have, an X amount of time to do something, and if I don't, then people start asking a lot of questions, as opposed to what's the quality of the work being put out, instead of just why isn't something done that you said you should get done.
Right. And a lot of Scrum processes will build in this concept of, things will be done when they're done. I would argue at that point you're running more of a Scrumban type process, because, one of the upfront definitions of the Scrum process is that you have an iteration and you complete the work inside that iteration, and you might not get everything done, right? I get that. And then we do the game playing where it's like, okay, well, what is this, 50% done? Is it 20% done? Is it 30% done? And then we move stories forward. Some of the organizations that I've seen that have kind of caught on to the fact that this is a waste of everyone's time, just move the story into the next. And honestly, because of the way math works, your sprint commits amortize out across X number of sprints. When I was starting Agile, we were looking at, okay, we need 2 weeks of work to figure out exactly what our velocity is, and once we know what our velocity is, then we can predict the future, right? And that, again, that's assuming that story points is a valid metric for velocity, which I have some issues with scientifically and also just in practice. I've not really seen it work great. It works well if you cook the books, but I've not seen it work great just from a raw data perspective. The thing that I like about Kanban, to converse that, and again, I'm not saying one is superior to the other, they both have their trade-offs, is that Kanban's focus is more on do the work and then we take your past performance to predict the future, right? To me, that is more scientific. And me being, a guy that likes science, I like to do things based on more accurate measurements. It's just the engineer in me, as opposed to kind of, again, the entropy-laden idea of story points, where it's like, oh, I just guessed, right? And again, there's this concept that amortizes across teams, et cetera.
Yeah, I would say, the other part of that is human nature is always to sort of take story points and try and translate it into hours, which like is just like the ultimate, we're taking a guess at this point. If you ask me how many hours any task is going to take, like I could be as seasoned of an engineer as possible, I'm never going to get it right. It's just the nature of the beast. There's always unknowns. And so, if story points actually represent complexity, then great. That tells me what I need to know, and we can say that's, too many story points and we need to break this up. And that to me, like, feels right. When we get into most of the sort of Scrum implementations that I've worked in, so many people are trying to equate, 5 points equals, 20 hours or whatever the case is. And that's where it starts to really like fall apart. And somebody from the engineering side, right, who's doing the work is going to say, well, okay, I'm not sure. Let me add my padding to the backside. So that 5 now becomes an 8. Sure, we look better, but like, is any more work being done? No, it's just, we're gaming metrics. And so that concept of freedom in Kanban, where it's like, we're not really going to try and guess at this. We're just going to do it. And like you said, we're going to look at it at the end and say, okay, the work that we did took X amount of time. So let's use that as our predictor moving forward, as opposed to just engineering guessing at story points, which get incorrectly translated to hours, which then we're trying to, make assumptions based on time from that.
Yeah, any system. So any system that you implement, both from a business perspective and your personal life, I don't care where it is, needs to drive the behavior you wish to see. So if your system is designed to have people fudge the numbers, then that's the behavior you should expect out of your engineering team. I've run into some toxic leaderships, unfortunately, where folks have said, well, I don't want developers to hedge because, they're just going to sit around and not do anything, or just that's nonsense. One, that's a pathological view of how you lead a team. But two, is the system you're putting in place encouraging that type of behavior? And again, there's good implementations of Scrum out there. I'm not hating I'm not hating universally on Scrum. I do think that it has some challenges that the industry believes that Scrum has solved all of our software engineering problems, and I disagree. I don't think that it has, because it still includes engineering, building software still includes human beings as a part of the process. And what Sam just elaborated on is one of the key issues that I have, is that if you're in a situation where you're being held to target metrics, you're very likely going to do what you can to preserve yourself. Now, sort of, let's look at Kanban and the difference. Kanban or a any pull-based system, if you don't use Kanban, there are other things like ShapeUp. There are other SDLCs out there. A pull-based system focuses on looking at how long it took for us to do the work and then using that as a baseline moving forward. Now, this is uncomfortable from an executive perspective, right? Because as an executive, I don't truly know when my thing's going to be done until I have some form of past performance, right? And if you don't know how software is built, and a lot of executives don't, it's not hating, it's just true that a lot of business owners aren't software developers, and they've learned what they know about software engineering from their friends or from their management classes or from the Scrum website or from some consultant that sold them on this is how you do it, and trust me, I'm an expert, right? That's what we say in this business. And they're put into a position to where their expectations are that there is a solved way to get to an end point with some baseline business idea. And the fact is that that's not true, right? It depends on the expertise in your team. It depends on the expertise in your product team and your product crew. It depends on how well those folks communicate. And it depends on your business idea and how succinct you are in describing what you're trying to build, right? You could describe something and an engineer would take it totally differently because they're just different humans with different brain spaces. Executives who are uncomfortable with entropy, one, you need to learn to be a better entrepreneur. Sorry, get good, right? Entropy is how we live as an entrepreneur. As a business owner, entropy is unfortunately a fact of life. And you have to understand that you need to account for this in any system that you work in. So when you're running Kanban, the difference there is that you're using past performance to predict the future, and you need some time period to spin that up and get a true directional, hey, we're going in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, the other part of that is, sort of what you said with that. In order for an executive to make sure that we're building the right thing, we need those touch points, and we need the ability to be agile enough to make changes when they see a demo and think to themselves, hey, that's not what I had in mind. I maybe described it that way, but what in my mind actually I was thinking was, something totally different. Some Scrum implementations that I've worked in, we've done 1 week sprints, and that agile nature tends to work pretty okay. I've worked in other, implementations where your sprint is 4 weeks, and the ability to be agile out of that is much less. You don't have that same ability to say, okay, some new information is coming in, and the sprint is already set, so it's okay, we'll get to it in a month. When by the time it gets released, now we're looking at 2 months, and maybe something has changed even more, and we're just looking at too long, essentially. Whereas that Kanban world, that pull-based system world, if I were to show you something and then you tell me that's not exactly what you want, You can just go ahead and stick something right on top of the stack and say, go fix what we just had. And we'll be able to get that out much faster. And in our iteration in that world, it just moves faster from what you see and you didn't like to our ability to fix it. So, I've certainly worked in some Scrum worlds where they're very comfortable with short sprints, and that ability and change and agility to do that, has worked very well. But I've also worked in some where it's 4 weeks, it's way too long, and that agility sort of gets lost, and it doesn't really become an agile. It becomes like a mini waterfall that we're always headed over, which I think if we were to tell anybody, hey, you're just running a waterfall system, they would, be beside themselves, because of course nobody wants to do that anymore.
In many ways, Scrum can be seen as just mini waterfall. Like you're just running in a bunch of little waterfall sprints because you're doing all your planning up front, which again is kind of insane, but it works for some people in some organizations. But you're doing all your planning up front. You're aligning all of the estimates up front. You think that you hope that that's correct, and then the idea is that the math sort of factors out at the end because you look back at X number of sprints and you kind of average that. Which you're doing the same thing in Kanban too, by the way. The only differentiator is that you have more granular data around when tickets are done, and it's real data. Because the other big difference that Sam mentioned here, intrinsically in your statements, the skill level of your team is going to dictate how these processes run. If you have some extremely well-seasoned developers that know how to build software and understand all of the entropy and all the issues, and they're very well versed in many of the technologies that exist today, then they're going to perform highly in any system. They'll perform highly in Scrum, they'll perform highly in Kanban, they'll perform probably highly in Waterfall, I would argue, because they know what to do. They've solved all of the authentication and authorization issues from a back end. They know all of the nuances and all of the issues for a mobile application, right? They know how to build a custom module in Apache to do crazy things from MIME types. Like, they get it. They understand it. But that's not the reality of software engineering, right? Every single company has an ecosystem of developers that they're looking to support. And that ecosystem means that you have some junior engineers, some SWE 1, SWE 2, SWE 3s, however your organization is aligned. And each of these humans have a different perspective and a different level of understanding around how that particular piece of software, that ticket, needs to be developed, right? So that in and of itself is a trade-off and a drawback of each of these systems. I would argue Scrum provides more of a sophisticated, well, not sophisticated, excuse me, let me start over. Scrum provides more of a formal system for a diverse set of people on a team, right? Because it's more like it's got more padding, it's a little bit fluffier, it's more process laden. You have people shepherding this along. You've got your Scrum Master who's kind of like cheerleading you on the side and removing blockers and going out and getting what you need. You've got your business owners all sitting in the same room doing the same thing. So it gives you a set of ceremonies, to use the Scrum term, that allow you to be productive, right? Now, Kanban, on the other side, doesn't provide any ceremonies. This is the other very important piece for those of you listening. If you don't know this, Kanban is just a process. You can apply to anything. I do Kanban for my chores for my kids, right? It's not a software development lifecycle. It is a set of ideas that came out of Toyota production management long back in the day. There's an entire discipline around it, Lean Six Sigma. From a business perspective, there's books that read like sand that have been written on this that help you understand the intrinsic ideologies behind the system, right? It's used in hospitals for replacing medical supplies. It's a really flexible process, and that flexibility is the downfall of it, because that means you can do anything you want. If you want to have daily stand-ups in Kanban, go have freaking daily stand-ups. If you want to do story points in Kanban, go freaking do story points. Who cares? The idea is that Kanban provides a pull-based experience for your engineering team where they pull that ticket off and they do the work, and they push it out. Now there are other very important concepts in Kanban. I'm not talking about like whip limits, and I get all of that, right? I've been doing Kanban for a long time. We're not going to talk about those right now because those are very deep in the weeds. They're extremely important. You need to know what a whip limit means if you're going to work truly in an actually Kanban system. But from a comparison perspective, because Scrum doesn't have this idea, although you can also put whip limits on Scrum if you want, Kanban allows the team to be independent, right? Where they don't have a sprint commit. They're not being pushed to do work by a Scrum Master. They can go and pull the work off and do the work. And at the end, once you look at the metrics across a Kanban system, you're going to find that they're on average more accurate. At least that's our experience, right? And folks can perhaps provide some counterexamples, and I'm sure there are Scrum systems out there that are extremely accurate around velocity because it's been honed over a very long period of time to be a well-oiled machine. And your large enterprises that run safe, like they all understand how to implement Scrum in a professional manner. But your average team out there, your average startup, your average mid-cap company, to me, Kanban is a better fit if you have a highly skilled, seasoned team. But if you have a diverse population of engineers, it might not be a better fit. It depends.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I started out, if I were to start in a Kanban world, and in the system that, I was working in when I first graduated and had my first job, if that was Kanban, I think I would have, I don't want to say stagnated, but certainly not grown at the same level that I was able to with working in a Scrum system. And part of that is, to your point, the diverse teams. Scrum sort of allows for, when we just plan up front, we can say, okay, JDov's capacity as our senior engineer, we're going to put his capacity at 75%, and his other 25 is going to, help junior engineers, and we can sort of mess with some metrics when we're planning, because that allows for us to sort of understand some of that growth. That independence, is something that comes when we're a little more seasoned. When I've been around for a little while and I can, understand the right questions to ask and the right way to phrase things, living in that new Kanban world, yeah, I have that freedom. I don't need all the extra support all the time where we need to plan that capacity around it and dock somebody else or dock myself capacity because we have all of that extra. So those big corporations that are hiring a lot of people out of college, first jobs, diverse populations of skill levels, Scrum definitely can make sense in those worlds, because you are hedging at some point of skill levels and time, and you just sort of need to make some trade-offs in certain places. Like once we're in like that smaller, maybe more veteran group, right, and more skilled engineers, and sort of how I view our teams at 7 Factor, Kanban can make a lot more sense. We know the right way to ask questions. We know who to go to for help, right? If I have a question around, architecture in AWS, I'm not going to sit here and twiddle my thumbs for 2 days. I'm going to just take a look at it and say, hey, JDov, can you come and help me out? And there are other things that other people can help with. And so, not having that, where we need to bake in extra time because we need to help, some other people, it can certainly allow us that independence and that freedom that Kanban gives us, where Scrum is very nice of a system for, I'm going to say, younger engineers to sort of get their feet wet and start to understand, what it is professional engineer, and not always just side project that I'm working on at home, where, timelines and deadlines I'm sure are nice, but nobody's holding me to that other than me.
Right. I've seen Kanban work for that level of diverse engineering talent if you have small teams. So if you have a team of 4 people, right, 2 pizza team to use the Amazon adage, then it can work as well because but you have to have a very tight mentoring and accountability framework in place on those teams, right? So if I come to work every day, I jump on Slack, I pull out my I pick my ticket off the top, and I'm cutting my PR. If nobody's checking up on me and saying and sort of making sure that I'm stewarding this process along, I'm going to take the time it takes. Because the other thing that the other issue that I've heard from Kanban, a lot of the people that don't like it say that, well, developers can just take as long as they want to do things. Well, I mean, I'm sorry, that's a little bit of an advantage, but the valid point there is that there's no sustainable pace set. Now, I'm not talking about a death march. I'm not talking about Scrum can sometimes produce a death march, as we talked at the top of the show, where you sign up for the commit, and again, if you're in a bad management scenario, you're going to be running as fast as you can to complete that commit, right? And sometimes that means you overwork, which it can be a bad thing depending on your context. And so Kanban has the inverse issue where if a developer isn't taught to run at a certain pace, they're running 14-minute miles. And if the rest of the team isn't running 8-minute miles and challenging that 14-minute miler to speed up a little bit, then you're going to get this inefficient system. And I feel like this is where Kanban gets a bad rap. This is where a lot of people look at Kanban. They're like, why would I ever let developers take as long as they can? Like, and first, again, that's a bit pathological, but also it's a valid point that if the team isn't set up to move forward at a pace that is challenging, no one's going to grow. And no one's going to lean into their team and lean into the expertise around them to learn how to quickly stand up something that makes sense. Because, again, I want to be a part of a team of engineers that are moving towards a target. We know what we're building, and we're delivering into production as fast as we can, and we're producing value for the business. That is the best engineering teams I have been a part of, is when that's our focus. So Kanban can produce a bit of apathy if you're not careful. You have to have good team leads. You have to have very strong work ethic and drive on the team to fit that balance of, again, not overworking, but completing tickets. Like, a great example is I've worked in a Kanban system before where I just pulled the top ticket off, and it took me 12 hours to complete the ticket. And when I started, I just finished, right? I worked a 12-hour day. Now, some people would say, well, you overworked, and that's terrible, and you shouldn't do that. Well, I was in the middle of finishing my freaking ticket. Now, I didn't work 12-hour days for the rest of the week, right? I actually took some time off on a Friday because I had worked my 12, and I did have the concept, and my management was very cool about producing this concept of 40-hour work week, right? Maybe you do 45. It depends on what we need done, but just get your stuff done, and that's all that matters. If I work a 12-hour day and knock this ticket out and then move on to my next ticket tomorrow, and I work a 6-hour day and then I work to the next ticket and I work a 4-hour day, like whatever, as long as I'm producing value for the business, who cares about how long it takes me to complete that? And that's the flexibility that a lot of really good developers are looking for.
Yeah, I think that really hits the nail on the head where it's that flexibility, but that flexibility comes with strong leadership, because I've worked with people who were sort of new to the Kanban world, and the phrase like "don't let perfect get in the way of good enough" sort of rings true in my head, where like working with such a perfectionist, right? It wants the person wants every single thing to work, as well as it could possibly ever work, and you never need to come back to it. And as much as in theory I want to live by that, there are times where I sort of look at it and I say, the difference between 10 milliseconds in 15 milliseconds is not going to be the end of the world. And so there's a level of optimization there where, having that strong leadership to go to somebody and say, where are we at on this? And when they say, oh, it works, but I'm optimizing it, like, oh, okay, like, let's see what you got. And we can sort of, swarm around that to say, does this fit our needs? And sort of move past, some of these sort of hurdles that are self-made to some degree, right? And so I can sort of look at either system and say that these hurdles can get in our own way, where like Scrum, when I'm signing up for tickets, I can put myself in a world where I'm moving as fast as possible, and maybe I miss some things that could be optimized if I gave myself a little bit more time. And on the flip side, like Kanban, I can look at it and say I could take a week and a half to do something that, like, if somebody just like pulled me back for a second and said it works, great, like it's done in much less time. So both of those, we can sort of meet in a middle ground where, as long as we have the right mentorship and the right leadership to sort of be able to help everybody out of the weeds every now and then, just to sort of look at what we're doing, I think that's very, very important to a successful system, no matter what you're going to do.
100%. And I think, again, it is based on the level of expertise and the level of seasoning you have on your engineering team. Software economics is a thing that we're not taught in school, right? I went to formal school, Georgia Tech, go Jackets. We suck at football, but we're awesome at everything else. So I went to formal school. I did academic research, and we even had this idea in research as well, where it's like, look, it has to be right, but you don't need to obsess over an idea and spend so much time that you don't get the paper out, or you don't get the experiment complete. Like you want to experiment and iterate quickly and produce value for humanity, which was the idea behind the research that we're doing. Same thing. You want to iterate and move quickly and produce value for the company. And this idea of software economics, right? And there's a whole episode on my viewpoints on the economics of developing software, because a lot of engineers get this wrong. I myself have gotten this wrong a lot in my lifetime. The other brief thing I wanted to point out is that Kanban, one of my favorite things about Kanban is that it supports continuous delivery, I would argue better than Scrum, unless you borrow continuous delivery from, and by the way, continuous delivery is not a Kanban idea. It's its own idea. But if you are pushing tickets to completion mid-sprint, you're kind of Kanbaning a little bit, right? Because you're viewing each individual ticket as a unit of work that needs to be complete and pushed out. But you're wrapping the sprint commit around this idea. Right, and the best teams I've worked in, we finish that ticket. Going back to my 12-hour example, I spend 12 hours on a ticket. I complete it. It goes to production immediately. Right, there's no waiting, and this is what a lot of business owners really want. Right, they want this idea of continuous delivery. They don't want to wait on a feature being out. Now there are tons of difficulties in this. One, creating a ticket that can actually be continuously delivered. And I've had tons of arguments internally with developers over front and back end, left ways, right ways. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? And all this and that. But that's, again, another conversation. But assume for a moment you have the perfect ticket that can be produced or can be completed and pushed into production immediately once that ticket is done. I would argue Kanban is a superior force there, because it lets the team pull the ticket, work the ticket, execute the ticket, push it out. Pull the ticket, work the ticket, execute the ticket, push it out. Again, you can do this in Scrum, but you're technically not doing it. All you're doing is wrapping the metrics around this very fast, iterative, continuous delivery mechanism that you've put in place that allows you to get software into production.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of stumbling block with Scrum and continuous delivery tends to be, in my experience, in my experience, it tends to be, when we plan, we're only looking at capacity and how do I make you as close to your capacity as possible.
Right.
That doesn't
We're not
mean
looking
that,
at business value.
yeah, it doesn't mean that, like, I'm going to work on, a ticket that, is isolated in the sense that, it's only my work that matters for what I'm trying to do. I could be reliant on two other people on my team to get stuff done to make that ticket, valuable and viable in production. And if I prioritize mine first, and then I'm waiting on, the other two to get done before we can push that to production, we're stuck. I can't get that out there. And sort of like you said, that the Kanban world, where it is just like, obviously ticket writing is a whole separate podcast or two, to get that. But if you do have that that correct ticket in this ideal world, where it has all of the business value in it. I, as an engineer, want to see my work out in production and usable and, being consumed by people as soon as possible. I don't want to sit there and say I finished it. Okay, now I need to wait until 2 weeks from now for somebody to push it to production for that to have like actual value. So like I part of it is just from an engineer perspective. Like if I build something, I'm excited to see people use it and feedback from it, and see where it can go from there. And so in that Kanban world, the continuous delivery that is sort of aided from the Kanban pull system, it like adds that extra excitement where it's not hurry up and wait. It's just a push it on. You can see people using it, and like that's awesome. From just an engineer perspective. So that is certainly another benefit that even just beyond continuous delivery, like seeing my stuff in production and useful, right? And the faster we can get there, is always what I love to see.
Yeah, and ticket writing is a fun topic. Maybe we'll do an episode on that if we get enough interest. But I have a lot of very potentially controversial opinions on ticket writing. But tickets tend to be a DAG, right? A directed acyclic graph. You start with an entry point ticket, and that entry point ticket points to a dependency, and that dependency points to a dependency. And sometimes you'll get a cycle, which is a bad thing, right? And I like to view tickets like this scientifically as a DAG, and just look at the connection point between tickets, because if you have a cycle, you have an issue in how you've designed your product, right? You have an issue in how you've coupled the deployment and the implementation of some set of features. And it's rare for that to happen, but it is a good thing to put in your back pocket when you're analyzing your backlog is, do I have some form of loop in there? But Scrum likes to assume that tickets are individually units of work, or at least close to a unit of work. This is this idea of if you get a 13, break it down. And anytime you break down a ticket, you're inherently producing dependencies, because that ticket was written large for a reason. It's likely that the developer or the product owner had this cohesion of ideas when they produced this ticket, right? I want an A, a B, a C, a D, a E, and an F, and a G. Now, in some cases, it's very easy to break something down into independent work items because it's like a UI or it's a front end or something. But when you start trying to break down something like a really big ticket that has a lot of business logic in it, that's all in the same idea. An order processing is a great example that I've run into in my career, where it's very difficult to decouple some of these things. And you've all done this before, right? Those of you watching and listening, when you've worked a ticket or you've created a ticket, it's gotten broken down and they have to move together, right? They have some form of dependency in place. If you're using Kanban, you skip the breakdown, right? You just hand it to the developer or developers. By the way, a ticket can have multiple people. It's called pairing or mobbing. There are plenty of really good ways to get multiple hands on one target ticket. Once you have that ticket in play, that chunk of business value gets produced on the other end. Now, there's obviously cases where this is too big. If a ticket takes 3 weeks, yeah, we're trying to boil the ocean there. The same ideas apply to ticket breakdown in Kanban that do in Scrum, but to a more coarse grain, as opposed to trying to get everything to below an 8, which is what I've seen is the average number on most Scrum systems. You're okay with a 13, right? You're okay with a slightly larger ticket or something that takes slightly longer period of time, because when you look at it from a WIP perspective and a cycle time perspective, it's a blip on the radar, and it's a standard deviation out of your standard curve, and it factors out, right? Math. I love math. It's awesome. Math has no feelings. And so at the end of it, the important thing is that you're focusing on business value in those tickets, though. Be it Scrum or be it Kanban, you're producing a set of features that go out the other end that creates something that people want to use. So let's talk about quality for a minute. Sam, we're test people, right? We like tests. And I want to talk about how Scrum and Kanban, what's the differentiator between how they encourage testing? Again, within reason. Certain people are going to do better than others in adhering to a test-based philosophy, but I also think that each one provides different facilities for those. What do you think?
Yeah, I've worked in this sort of comes back to the thought in Scrum where we want to get everything below a certain size ticket. Um, and I've worked in teams where we've had to break up work and have a dev ticket and a test ticket in order for it to sort of fit the model of everything under a certain size. And that can be okay in the sense of like, great, now things are broken up and we have dedicated time to test things. But what I've sort of run into is in the Scrum world, we race to finish some tickets and get the functionality correct, and we get tests that maybe meet some coverage standards, whether or not they are all encompassing and quality tests is questionable. And so because we have these sort of race conditions that we always are up against and pushing towards speed over quality in some regards, it just has lent itself on teams that I've been in the past to maybe less quality, but the coverage standards that people look at and executives look at quite a bit, where it's run the code coverage report and does it say 90%? Great, good enough. Whether or not that actually is testing things appropriately is a completely different question. In our sort of Kanban worlds and in the way that we run things, testing being built into the ticket that we're working on and not necessarily caring about that speed as like the be all end all and the time that it takes, allows for our engineering teams to spend more time making sure our tests are quality tests. They're actually testing something versus, well, I hit that if statement once and so
Got my
like
code
it's
coverage.
covered.
I'm good.
Yeah, and like, regardless of any edge cases that may come out of that, like it's covered, done, check. The Kanban poll-based world where like we're not so worried about meeting an hour's deadline or a general size because we said that 2 months ago when we were looking at the ticket initially. When we don't have to worry about that anymore, and we're just sort of able to incorporate the the quality into the ticket, and then when we look back and say how long did something take so we can sort of help predict the future a little bit, that testing and that quality is built into our predictions moving forward. We're not worried about the like, okay, well, I think development's going to take me a day. I think if I want to do good testing, it'll take me another day. But if I want to do sort of like questionable testing, it'll take me 3 hours. So yeah, I can get all of this done in this sprint, and I'll sign up for it, right? That sort of having that question be in your mind is always sort of going to shade you towards, I think, a little bit less quality testing and a little bit more, well, I can cut corners if I need to and still get it done, and everybody's still going to be happy. So I think having that sort of independence and freedom where like I'm not locking myself into a time frame allows us to make sure that the tests that we're writing are actually testing what we did, as opposed to just meeting a standard on a code coverage report and seeing green lines and we're done.
Right. And you hit the nail on the head. Deadline dread is a thing. And again, deadlines are normal. I'm not here to say that we should throw away all deadlines. I don't have a problem with deadlines at all. Deadline dread, however, does force people to do things that they perhaps normally wouldn't do, right? When someone's under pressure, they're going to revert to their most base instincts. And the first thing that I have seen go out the window, unless you're a test-driven guy or gal or person, is testing. People don't do it. They're like, to hell with the code coverage. I'll deal with it next sprint, right? Or we'll build, as you said, test tickets. I hate test tickets. I hate it. Hate it, hate it, hate it. And that's the thing. A lot of teams don't include testing in their estimation points. In theory, if you're doing test-driven development correctly, then it is built in, right? Because a lot of folks have this unfortunate perception that test-driven and building tests is slower. It is a little bit slower, but an expert at doing this, and someone who's done it for a while, someone who's maybe just learning but is under the wing of an expert, even I've seen that be successful, can go just as fast as if you were to write the test after. And sometimes even faster, because you have a feedback loop in your code instead of having to run the entire Spring Boot application, which can take a couple of seconds to boot up even on modern hardware, and looping through your Postman calls to your API and then looking at your logs. You just run your test, and it tells you if it works or not. It's so easy. And those are the things that we throw out the window when we get into time crunch. And Kanban, I agree with you 100% in that if the ticket's going to get done when the ticket's going to get done, then that means, again, within reason, with a fair pace, call it an 8-minute mile pace, then I certainly am going to write tests because I don't feel the dread of I need to get this done. I'm just going to write my tests, make sure my software is correct, and then push it out into production, again, following continuous delivery practices, as quickly as I can. To me, that adds a whole lot more value. Now, can you do this in Scrum? Yes, you can do all the things we're talking about in either framework, right? It just depends on how you've been incentivized as an engineer and what the system is forcing you to do based on psychology, which is something nobody thinks about, and also based on the science of how the process is sorted.
Yeah, and I think just, one more thing on that. One of the things that I love to tell people when they're starting to question like why things are taking a little bit longer, and when I can say we're doing our due diligence and putting quality testing in, it is going to save us tenfold down the road when that bug comes in, and we don't have to, we know that our tests are meeting the specifications that we had initially. If I cut corners on the testing, that bug comes in, 3 months down the road, and we have to refigure out everything that's going on in our code. Like, that's driving up our costs way more than if we just put in the upfront effort to, get the code right in the first place, get quality testing in the first place. That speed comes maybe not initially, but the benefits that we're going to see down the road are much more significant than any time loss we're going to have up front.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam, a lot for the candid conversations. I'm going to wrap this episode up. If those of you who are listening are interested in potentially transitioning between Scrum and Kanban, or maybe you want to have a discussion about some of the topics that we've added here, I would invite you to check us out on LinkedIn and check us out on the website. We're very approachable. I've said some hardline things here, but honestly, anyone who knows me knows that I like to just talk about how we're approaching problems, right? I want to keep an open mind, and I love to talk with other people with an open mind and to discuss what are the benefits and the drawbacks of each of these. So check us out online if you want to see more. Sam, thank you for joining me, sir. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Give us a like and a subscribe if so, and we'll see you on the next one.